So welcome. I sort of want to open with where are we now? This is part 2 of our series, Shifting Landscapes. And one, it was tough to decide how to do the brochure. So that's a really administrative kind of task, but it's also about where are we in the pandemic? Did we include the pandemic? Did we skirt around it? Did we ignore it? And it was sort of, I've watched myself and tried to understand because it was difficult to know where I was December, let's say almost all through the month. And I'm thinking there are 3 paths. And it's as I've looked at journalists in the newspapers or the magazines talking about where we are, and then see reviews of artwork or see things on TV. It does seem that everybody is a mishmash and that sometimes we're in one path and sometimes in another and then sometimes the third. So the paths that I have seen is one, the biggest one about the pandemic is disruption. And the disruption that it keeps causing, it's like, you know, first COVID, then Delta, now Omicron. I have friends who have all been shot up, boosted, et cetera. But COVID came into their house, and several of them have come down with it, and you want to be done with it. There's this we're overwhelmed. I'll sometimes be depressed. I didn't think I was depressed, but I'm grouchy. Okay, we'll go this way. You know, and it's like, yeah, you know, you want to go, why are they so grouchy? And I'm like, okay, excuse me, Brooke, but you know, what did you just say? And things like that you kind of just have to laugh and hold yourself in good stead. But just feeling like it's drudgery, you know, some days. The other is the flip. I want to be happy. I go into a manic state. I am happy. It's good. I love it. It's wonderful. There's, you know, what happened to the pandemic? I don't know. I don't care. You know, we just live life. Let's just keep going. Then there is what I'm calling this middle path, which is really the adult that sort of understands that there's still a pandemic. We still need to wear masks. We're here once again, more masks than we were when we started last fall. That's the state of things. We take a deep breath. You can even hear my voice has all suddenly gotten deeper registers. There's that violin inside the lungs, you know, and that it's like, okay. And that I can also say, all right, these are serious things. We know how to deal with it. And there are ways in which I can be happy, but it's not this manic happiness. I don't have to force it upon myself. And you can feel when other people move through these stages. That's where I think that we kind of are and are drifting through. We can be both the really depressive, we can be the really happy, and then find what I'm calling the sort of the adults and the one that can be free. So what I have found helps is actually it's the cover sheet on the handout that we handed you, and it's not from COVID time, and that's sort of the wonderful thing about it. Is it's about life itself, and it's from a philosopher who is new to me, Alain de Botton, and it's a book that he wrote called what is it called? It's The School of Life, and his approach to life itself is this, that I think that it just became what I wanted to have as setting the stage for this particular session and series. He says, any idea of the normal currently in circulation is not an accurate map of what is customary for a human to be. We are, each one of us, far more compulsive, anxious, sexual, tender, mean, generous, playful, thoughtful, dazed, and at sea than we are encouraged to accept. That whole panoply of who we are as human beings. The January series tonight is our 3rd topic of the 6 that we are doing. It's education. There are a team of 6. You may have seen some of the the pictures earlier, we have them this time around of the 6 people. 2 are not here, Mike McKinney and Matt Sanderson. They were 2 faculty members from West Shore. Mike has since also retired. But Kathy Organ is here in front. Kathy Calabretta, I'll come back to Kathy in a minute. And then Thomas Strady is back at my working all the technology. That's been the team. We gathered last May, May of 20, and we've been working on producing the series since. And those photos came from Zoom, almost all the time. So tonight, Kathy, what we did as a team was we each selected a topic that we thought was important to begin to look at this post-pandemic time. We thought there would finally be one. And what did we think was important? Not necessarily the most important thing, but what was on our minds and what is doable to explore. And Kathy, being an educator, early childhood for much of her career, but also doing home ec with high school. And she came to the table and said, I'm in education, and what is the 1619 project? And what is CRT? And sort of education grew out of, and Kathy looks at us and we're all going, I don't know, I've heard of them, but don't know quite what they are. And tonight our approach is, and for next week for CRT, is not to anticipate anyone here has read anything of 1619 project, but they would like to know something about it and how it might be used. There's been a lot of talk on both sides of pro and con about the piece, about the document, about the history. Sort of let's do an evening of this so that we can make our way through. These sessions begin to explore the topic. You will learn by the end of the night, if you may have heard something about historiography, which is how do historians do history as it moves through time. What changes happen. It's also about how do historians critique history and how do we finally arrive at what's a history of a particular period, though that also continues to change. As we sort of all probably know and understand that history is written for the future rather than for the past. It's a story we tell ourselves to decide where we are today and who we want to be in the future. And it continues to evolve over time. There are all kinds of revisions to history. As we go through this, I just wanted to set a stage that I continue to go back to something that helps me when I think I have my answers for certain things, and then somebody presents some new information, and I go, do I really have to look at something again, and maybe redecide things? And that's something from Hannah Arendt, and that's the difference between thinking and knowing. And Arendt said that what we have to do sometimes is put what we know on hold. We put it over here while we think, while we take in new ideas. And then when we have them and we've evaluated them, we can look at what we once knew and say, do I still think that's the greater truth for me? Or do I need to make some new adjustment to that based upon this new thinking I've done? And then that will become my new, what I know. And so that's sort of how we evolve. And it's a way in which then I can also stop getting into like ego trips and things like that about this is what I've always believed and, and I have to, or, sort of anything else about, I want to ditch it, but it doesn't make sense for me to ditch it. And she helps me through that. The other piece is the thing that we talked about last year on science is the scientific process. Because the scientific process is also the critical thinking process. So it's you have a thesis, you have a question, you have something you want to explore. You marshal your evidence. What are your ideas behind it? What's the argument that you have that seems to be true? Then you do an analysis of that and sort of spreading it about in terms of your ideas and how do you arrive at a conclusion. and so it ends with a conclusion. But it's always in the humanities and in the social sciences. It goes through reiterations of this. It's a cycle that people keep using to keep sharpening how we think about things. So those are just some guidelines that I hope might be helpful as we go through this tonight. I want to just note, besides the 16 members, Eric Smith is sitting way in the back. He is the director of the library, and the library is one of the chief co-sponsors. They have put in cash from their own budget into this project. And we thank you very much. And you have allowed from the very, very beginning, Thomas, to be part of this team. And there have been hours and hours committed. Sue Carlson is over there. Thank you very much for all of your work. She does lots of our press releases and all of those items. Nathan is in the back. He is a work study kind of student for the library, employed by the library. And our gratitude also goes to everybody sitting here who pays taxes. That's probably everybody, because we've been funded by Michigan Humanities Commission, which is an affiliate of the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. And we've also been funded by MCACA, which is the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. And so we are grateful. So moving on, it is my great privilege to be able to introduce our speaker, Robert Cook. He is in his cottage in England, near Yorkshire. He is an emeritus professor of American history. You can see where, approximately where, oops, not on there quite so much, but you see London. Anyway, it is about, I think, 1 o'clock his time. So he's been very, very generous. He said, when I said, we could Zoom you, we could record you. He said, that's pretty static. I was like, yes, great. So he's with us here tonight. He has 7 books to his name. They have been published by no less than Johns Hopkins University. He is a writer, a British writer of the American South, and he has had 2 of his books published by Louisiana State University. Those are quite achievements. And he has also had his work published in the Journal of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Again, a prestigious journal for this period of time that he's working in. And we're very pleased that he is with us tonight. So it's not only his credentials, though. It's like, okay, why out of all the people that we could have asked to join us, why Robert Cook? So I got to, I looked at these credentials, and then I read deeply into a couple of his articles, and then, we're working on the computer and chatting. And it was very clear, I was impressed by his clarity when he wrote the articles, that he was an academic. There was no question about his erudition, if you will, but he also spoke without academic ease. He's a public intellectual, in my mind, brings what he has learned through the research to people, and so that we can understand it, learn from it, add it into our lives. He understands how to navigate through different points of view. So that was one of the things that was also important. He was able to look at different people's responses to the 1619 project and say what he thought was helpful about those responses and which were not, or might be wrong. And also, while it wasn't a requirement at all, it is what makes him special, as I say, that he agreed to do this live. So, with further ado, please welcome Robert Cook. Good evening.
Thank you, Brooke. Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me clearly. It is a very great pleasure to be with you this evening, even if for me this evening is about 17 minutes past midnight in the United Kingdom. I want to thank Brooke and Thomas and all the other members of the Shifting Landscapes organizing team for inviting me to speak. It's a great privilege to speak to you tonight, And I think this sounds to me like a really great community-based initiative. So I'm speaking to you, as Brooke said, from the county of Yorkshire in Northern England, and I'm hoping that my internet connection to Michigan holds up for the next couple of hours. So just to repeat, my name is Robert Cook. I've been a British-based historian of the United States for more than 40 years. Although I retired from teaching at the University of Sussex down on the south coast of England in August 2020, I remain what is known in the trade as research active. So I'm still writing books and articles about American history. Although I've written and taught about the modern African-American civil rights movement and the African-American experience in the United States more broadly, I'm essentially, I think of myself as a specialist on the American Civil War and the contested memory of that watershed event. So during my talk, I will draw on my work on historical memory, and I will speak about the 1619 Project, often referencing my own work on American history. And I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. First of all, I'll explain what I think the project is and what the aims of the project are. Secondly, I'll discuss some of the criticism. There's been a lot of criticism of the project from all parts of the political continuum in the United States. So I'll talk about some of that. And then finally, in the longer section of my talk, I want to proffer my own assessment of the 1619 Project in the light of my own experiences as a professional historian of the United States. So let me begin by talking about the project itself, just explaining exactly what it is. So it really begins, the story begins in August of 2019. That is 7 months after America's first Black president, Barack Obama, had been replaced in the White House by Donald Trump. And it was in August of 2019 that the New York Times magazine ran a special issue introducing readers to the 1619 Project. The issue contained an introductory essay by a woman named Nikole Hannah-Jones, who at the time was a Black staff writer on the New York Times magazine. And what she had done was to successfully pitch her idea for a special issue of the magazine to editor Jake Silverstein. The special issue also contained a bunch of essays which were written mostly by Black journalists and historians. And the subject matter of these essays was pretty wide-ranging, but each of the essays tried to connect the central themes of race and racism to other topics in US history, like the American Revolution, like the growth of American capitalism, for example. And there's also a short piece by the Princeton-based scholar Kevin Kruse, which linked racial discrimination to traffic chaos in modern Atlanta by detailing how suburban whites had resisted the expansion of the city's metro system because they didn't want African Americans from poorer parts of town having easy access to their localities. So these essays then covered quite a wide range of topics. I just want to focus just for a few minutes on Hannah Jones's essay, her introductory essay, because it was here really that she made clear the main purpose of the project. And that project, in her view, was both disruptive and patriotic. She wanted to end what she regarded and indeed what many other people regarded as the dangerous marginalization of Black people in the telling of America's national story. Nikole Hannah-Jones was born and brought up in a town I know quite well, Waterloo, Iowa, which is a pretty unlovable industrial town that had attracted many Black migrants during the course of the mid-20th century. And those migrants included her own grandmother. Living on the wrong side of the tracks, educated in essentially segregated schools, she recalled that she had never understood why her father, who was a Black military veteran, a man who had found himself stuck in a range of dead-end jobs in Waterloo, she could never quite understand why he had wanted to fly the American flag in the corner of his yard. Only now, she wrote in this introductory essay, did she realize that her father flew the Stars and Stripes to signify that Black people's contribution to America was, and I quote, indelible, that the United States simply would not exist without us. Hannah-Jones proceeded in this essay, the same essay, to detail how the contribution of African Americans to American history and American life had been largely ignored. And she tried to show how disruptive the reinsertion of Black people's history into the national narrative would be. In a phrase which was clearly intended to grab readers' attention, she asserted that the United States was, and again I quote, a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. And that was because, in her view, the founding fathers did not believe Thomas Jefferson's ringing claim in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. She did not believe that that claim applied to people of color. America's history as a nation, she insisted, began not in 1776, but in 1619, when the first boatload of enslaved people arrived in colonial Virginia from Africa. Despite being constantly oppressed, she wrote, and I think here she was pursuing her theme of Black patriotism. Despite being oppressed, she wrote, African Americans fervently adhered to Jefferson's creed. Through centuries of protest, she wrote in this essay, we have helped the country to live up to its founding ideals. And not only for ourselves, she continued, Black rights struggles paved the way for every other civil rights struggle, including women's and gay rights, immigrant and disability rights. Without the strenuous and patriotic efforts of Black Americans, our democracy today would look very different. It would not look like a true democracy at all. Now, no assertion demonstrated the disruptive intention of the 1619 project more clearly than Hannah-Jones's claim that the American Republic had been born in slavery and not in liberty. The founding fathers, she claimed, had revolted against Britain in the 18th century, not because they loved freedom, but because they believed and feared growing British hostility to slavery. They feared that it would lead to the destruction of what slave masters like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson regarded as their right to own fellow human beings as property. Now, this was a pretty dubious contention, and I'll say a little bit more about this argument in a moment. But for now, I'll just say that the project has survived the substantial criticism which it initially attracted a range of criticism from mainstream historians, from conservative politicians and commentators, and also from outraged communists. With the aid of the liberal Pulitzer Center, the special edition of the New York Times that came out in August 2019. That's now been turned into a web-based teaching resource, which is used by thousands of teachers in all 50 states of the Union. And at the end of last year, a greatly expanded version of the project was published in book form, and a children's version has also come out as well. Although 3 states, I think this is right, but no doubt someone may correct me, 3 states, certainly Georgia, Florida, and Texas, have explicitly banned use of the project in state schools. It seems pretty clear to me that the 1619 project has legs. The project is used by significant numbers of teachers right across America today, and I'm pretty sure it will continue to be used by them for a good while yet. And just before I move on to discussing criticism of the 1619 project, I really want to stress that the 1619 project is not the same thing as critical race theory. They are 2 very different things. There are connections, but they are essentially different things. Critical race theory, I know, has been weaponized by some politicians in the United States and has been the subject of a good deal of criticism recently. And it is also true that the 1619 project has also been weaponized as well by some politicians in certain states. But just very briefly, and I know you're going to talk more about CRT in the next session, advocates of CRT argue that white supremacy has been and remains embedded in American jurisprudence and in American institutions of all kinds. But CRT is a theory which is not only taught, but it's also critiqued in graduate schools. And we should not forget that America has some of the best graduate schools in the world. CRT is not, to my knowledge, being disseminated by high school teachers across America. As one contributor to a fairly recent edition of NBC's Meet the Press quite rightly commented, if any child at an American school is proficient at CRT, then you have a genius on your hands. So the 1619 project is something rather different from CRT. The stated claim of Nikole Hannah-Jones and her supporters is that it is designed to demonstrate the active, the central, and the constructive role of African Americans in US history, really in order to promote better understanding between the races in America, and certainly not, as some politicians have alleged, to foster white guilt among school children. So its educational purpose, certainly from the point of view of Nikole Hannah-Jones and her allies at the New York Times and elsewhere, that purpose is essentially patriotic and not seditious in any way. So that is what the project is. And I think I'll just move on to talk about some of the criticism that the project has received. Now, whatever you think, what everyone thinks about the underlying motivation behind the project, its appearance in the New York Times Magazine unleashed a storm of criticism. Some of this criticism, I think, was fairly predictable, some of it perhaps less so. Most predictable was the reaction of many conservative politicians and commentators who quite rightly saw the project as an attack on the familiar linear narrative of American history. That narrative, I'm sure you're all aware of it, that narrative is grounded in the view that the United States was founded as a nation of liberty by freedom-loving patriots opposed to the tyrannical rule of Great Britain, personified, of course, by King George III. Although today, even the standard narrative, this orthodox narrative, acknowledges the persistence of slavery into the 19th century, acknowledges that it generated friction and ultimately a tragic civil war between North and South. The narrative essentially stresses the ability of Americans to overcome their differences in a shared effort to build a diverse and dynamic democracy, that city on a shining hill that is the envy of the world. And the emphases are very much on the exceptional nature of the American story, on the positive aspects of capitalist economic development, and particularly on the remarkable ability of American democracy and the constitution that underpins that democracy to respond effectively to internal and external threats. The thrust of this American folktale is broadly consensual and essentially self-serving. And I want to stress that there is nothing exceptional about this. This is not a case of American exceptionalism. All nations, to a greater or lesser degree, tell stories about themselves, and these stories, on the whole, tend to be very positive. They tend to be highly selective. So in this American story, divisive themes and events in the nation's past are remembered highly selectively. So Northerners and Southerners are reunited pretty quickly after the tragic Civil War. The complex but critically important Reconstruction period is largely passed over, and the Black Power movement of the 1960s is rarely integrated into the story of the Civil Rights Movement. The story of the Civil Rights Movement is usually routinely rendered as a rather simplistic tale of American democracy righting itself with the help, of course, of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King in his guise as the deliverer of the 1963 I Have a Dream speech, not as the self-professed social democrat who condemned the war in Vietnam in 1967. The US victory over the Axis powers in World War II, of course, is very much a touchstone of the orthodox narrative. For surely no event exemplifies more clearly the moral superiority of the United States than its hard-fought and ultimately crushing defeat of evil, genocidal Nazis and fanatical Japanese militarists. So, not surprisingly, conservatives rushed to defend this rather comforting narrative from what they saw as the destabilizing untruths of the 1619 project. They condemned the project as seditious and also as a very dangerous attempt to pollute the minds of American school children with the idea that US history should be reframed as essentially racist. And they quickly mobilized to oppose its use in the public schools. In the spring of 2020, for example, Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas introduced what he rather interestingly called the Saving American History Act to prohibit federal money being used to assist teaching of the 1619 project. And over the next several months, 27 states passed versions of what are essentially divisive concepts legislation, which were designed to prevent the teaching of historical narratives that had white supremacy at their core. And as I say, at least 3 states, Georgia, Florida, and Texas, explicitly prohibit the teaching of the 1619 project in their schools. President Trump wade into the controversy by announcing the creation of what he called the 1776 Commission, tells you everything, to disseminate what he described as patriotic education. This new commission would protect children from what he saw as the left's attempt to distort US history by giving them access to what is genuinely inspiring and unifying in our history in order to generate what was described as the informed and honest patriotism that is essential for a successful republic. Conservatives were assisted, perhaps unwittingly, in their efforts to denigrate the 1619 project by the outraged response of several leading mainstream historians in the United States. These historians were led by the very eminent Princeton scholar and commentator Sean Wilentz. And these academics signed a letter to the New York Times openly criticizing the project for propagating what they described as intellectually falsehoods. And among those falsehoods, in fact, the most egregious falsehood, as far as they were concerned, was this claim that I mentioned earlier, that the American Revolution had been triggered by fears that Britain had been on the verge of abolishing slavery. There was, in fact, very little substance to this claim. There is no doubt about that. The American Revolution, like all historical convulsions, was a pretty complex event, but there is no evidence to suggest that the founding fathers, many of whom, of course, did claim to own slaves, there's no evidence really that they were motivated to rebel against Great Britain by fears that the British government was about to deprive them of their human property. Anti-slavery in Great Britain was merely in its infancy in the 1770s and 1780s. So the founders really could not have been moved by fears of British abolitionism. These kind of fears did influence American slaveholders, but not until the late 1830s and 1840s. So fears of British abolitionism only really began to influence Americans after Britain had emancipated its own enslaved people throughout its empire in the 1830s, and after the cotton and slavery nexus had become entrenched in the southern states. So this is several decades after the revolution. So this claim of Nikole Hannah-Jones and her supporters that the American Revolution had been triggered by fears of British abolition, I think were groundless, and the historians were absolutely right to point this out in their letter. These professional historians also pointed out other problems with the project, including what they saw as its downplaying of interracial efforts to promote social change in America. And this proved to be a central mode of attack for another group of critics. And these were, perhaps more surprisingly, hard-line American communists who really hated the 1619 project. So it's rather ironic, I think, that President Trump thought that the 1619 project was some kind of leftist conspiracy. In fact, some of the toughest criticism of the project has come from the American left. These critics, these communist critics of the project, of course, held that class, not racial conflict, class conflict, not racial conflict, held the key to American history. So the project, in their view, willfully ignored evidence, plentiful evidence of revolutionary cooperation between progressive whites and blacks. For example, in the abolitionist movement of the 1830s and 1840s, 50s, for example, and also the assertive labor movement of the 1930s during the New Deal period, when there was much evidence of black-white cooperation in CIO unions. The communists also pointed out that the American Revolution and the American Civil War had triggered progressive social change throughout the Western Hemisphere during the late 18th and 19th centuries. So in their view, the American Revolution, the American Civil War were radical events, genuinely radical events, and yet now the 1619 Project was trying to pour cold water on these revolutionary episodes in American history. Rather interestingly, as well as insisting that the project falsified American history, the communists also discerned a covert motive, what they saw as a covert motive behind the New York Times' decision to encourage its teaching in schools. The Times, they contended, was an ally of the Democratic Party, whose moderate pro-capitalist wing had a vested interest in dividing American workers by advancing identity politics rather than by promoting proletarian and interracial opposition to capitalist oppression at home and US militarism abroad. They also denounced the project as an instrument designed to advance the interests of the black middle class, who historically, certainly in recent decades, had appeared to benefit from an emphasis on race rather than class. Affirmative action policies, for example, might be a case in point. For the project's leftist opponents then, Hannah Jones's avowed patriotic intent and her evident failure to condemn US imperialism in the shape of the failed war in Afghanistan and the disastrous invasion of Iraq, these things were just more evidence to them of the project's political and intellectual bankruptcy. Well, not surprisingly, the 1619 Project continues to be attacked by politicians and commentators from all parts of the political continuum. And there is no doubt that the project was, in its original incarnation, deeply flawed in terms of its interpretive content. And I think it's probably true to say that neither Nikole Hannah-Jones nor editor Jake Silverstein have been particularly good at responding publicly to all of this criticism. That's a flaw, of course, that is not unique to themselves. But they have, in fact, made certain changes and some significant changes in the project's account of American history. And the one I'll flag up to you, really, the most significant change that I'm aware of is that they have really backed down on that potentially disastrous claim about the connection between the American Revolution and pro-slavery. But nevertheless, the central thrust of the project remains the same. It is that slavery, race, and racism should be regarded as central themes in the American story, and that the African-American contribution to US history must be celebrated and recognized, not marginalized or ignored. Now, at this point, I was going to offer to take some questions, but I'm inclined just to go on, really, and talk about the 1619 Project, try and assess it in the light of my own experiences as a professional historian. But if anybody does have a burning question at this stage, sure, I'll happily take a sip of water and take a pause. Well, that looks like no burning questions at this stage, so I'll keep going. So what I want to do in this final section.
Hello? Sorry. Yep. Okay. We do have a question.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you for your work on this, and perhaps your own work will reflect an answer to the question I'm about to ask. And so it's a great segue for you. So, but there's no doubt that the economic impact of free labor that cleared the marshes and swamps of the South led to a great deal of wealth concentrated in a very few number of hands that benefited not just the South, but the industrial North and the banking industries located there. Yes? Oh, maybe.
You said free labor. Did you mean slave labor?
Yes, I meant, you know, what I meant by labor that did not cost very much.
Essentially unfree labor.
I'm sorry, I meant free in the sense of economically.
Free to the slave masters. Sure. Yeah. I think you described you talked about the industrialized North. I think I just make the point that before the Civil War, the North was not industrialized. It was industrializing. I think is probably a better description of what was happening. Most of the what are now the Midwestern states, of course, were still predominantly agricultural. Although, of course, the railroads were beginning to move across the Mississippi by 1860. And there is no doubt, I think, that northern textile factories, and of course these factories are predominantly in the Northeast, were being fueled by slave-grown cotton, high-quality cotton. So there are obvious connections between slavery and capitalism in the North during this period. But I'm not sure if I'm unsure if there's another part to your question.
Only that's an important part of the American story that is not really taught or told enough. Yes, I would agree. So you're talking about that connection between Southern slavery and Northern capitalism and industrial growth.
I think that's all the questions we have right now, Robert.
Okay, great. Well, I'll keep going then. Thank you. So what I want to do now is to suggest that the 1619 project, though it is, I think, flawed, my own view is it should not be condemned automatically and should certainly not be banned by self-interested politicians from the classroom. And in order to make this argument, I'll need to address some popular misconceptions about history as a discipline and to explain how the project can be used to teach a more intellectually honest, a more inclusive and a more probing account of the American past. And this, I believe, is what is an approach that is more useful to the development of what President Trump's executive order creating the now defunct 1776 Commission referred to as an informed and honest patriotism that is essential for a successful republic. So first of all, cards on the table. I don't think any informed, rational, tolerant person can doubt that race and racism have played a central role in US history. Diverse and divergent attitudes to slavery informed the writing of the federal constitution in 1787. Just think of the fugitive slave provision of the Constitution and the infamous 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which was so hated by Northerners during the antebellum period, which counted enslaved peoples 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. So it's a clause designed, of course, to inflate the political power of the South within the early national polity. Think also of the way that race and racism informed the creation of the American abolitionist movement in the 1830s. It informed the founding of the modern Republican Party, of course, in the 1850s. It was founded as an anti-slavery and anti-Southern party during that decade. Race and slavery has everything to do with the secession of the Southern states in response to Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. And race and racism have everything to do with the outcome and consequences of the American Civil War. Don't forget that roughly 200,000 African Americans fought for the Union during the Civil War, and the war itself resulted in the Emancipation Proclamation, the liberation of 4 million, roughly 4 million black slaves, and some key amendments to the federal constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, which have everything to do with African Americans. The hostility of large numbers of white people to African Americans helps, among other things, to explain the ultimate failure of Reconstruction, the development of a racially segregated society in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th century. It has everything to do with the continuing impoverishment of many black folk after slavery, the limited gains of the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 1960s, and the mass incarceration of so many African Americans in recent decades. But simply, it isn't possible to tell the American story fully or accurately without integrating the African American experience effectively. So that's where I come from. But, and this is a very big but in my view, saying all of this, acknowledging the centrality of racism, African Americans to US history, this does not mean, in my view, that all American history can be explained by referencing slavery and the Black experience. And here I'm going to draw on my own expertise, and I just want to talk very briefly about the outbreak of the American Civil War, because this seems to me to be a case in point. And let's face it, no event in American history is more important than the outbreak of a disastrous civil war in 1861, in April 1861. That war killed at least 750,000 Americans. And as the continuing furore over the removal of Confederate statues makes clear, the Civil War has repercussions today. The current wisdom, which is very much reinforced by the 1619 Project, is that the Civil War cannot be explained without reference to slavery, and slavery is really seen as the key cause of that conflict. Now, it is true that you cannot explain the American Civil War without reference to slavery. The problem is that slavery alone, Northerners' opposition to it, and white Southerners' support for it, and particularly white slaveholders' determination to defend it against what they saw as Northern attacks upon it. These things will explain the decision of the Cotton States to leave the Union in the winter of 1861. And we know this because mid-19th century Southern whites were very honest about why they were seceding from the United States, They told us this in their secession ordinances and the documents attached to those ordinances. They made it very clear that the southern states were seceding because of their determination to defend slavery against northern attack, and specifically against Republican attack. And let's not beat about the bush. The rebel Confederacy was founded, in the words of Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, and I quote here, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. These are the words, as I say, of the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens in his cornerstone address, his chilling cornerstone address of March 1861. And I think that address should be required reading for all American high school students, because it really does give the lie to those people today who try to claim that the Civil War was all about some desire on the part of the southern states to defend their constitutional rights, or that it was about some obscure conflicts over economic tariffs. So there is no doubt the historical record supports this conclusion that slavery and racism explain the act of Southern secession. But they do not explain why the vast majority of Northerners, and of course I'm talking about Michiganders in this, it does not explain why the vast majority of Northerners refuse to allow the Southern states to leave the Union in peace. Northerners determined to combat secession because they believed the Union was worth saving. In their view, it was, as President Abraham Lincoln put it, the last best hope of Earth. They regarded the Union as a unique, viable democratic republic, one that provided hope for all people in a world which was dominated by authoritarian monarchical regimes. So I guess what I'm saying is that the most important event in United States history, the American Civil War, cannot be explained solely with reference to race. We need to factor in the emotional and political pull of unionism, what we might call mid-19th century American nationalism, in order to explain why the majority of Northerners opted to fight against what they saw as treason rather than yield to it in the spring of 1861. So I think here we have the central flaw in the 1619 project. It makes race the primary determinant of American history, the primary determinant. Now, I'm quite prepared to accept that race was a primary determinant of US history, but it was not the only one. I'm not a communist myself, but those hard left critics of the project have a point, it seems to me. Class conflict has always played a major role in American history. Key topics like the American Revolution, the Civil War, the agrarian radicalism of the 1890s, think of the Populist Party, for example, the labor organizing drives of the New Deal era, and even the African American experience itself cannot be understood without reference to class as well as race. And of course, I'm sure you're all aware that there have been many other leading forces in US history. Religion, for example, anti-communism in modern times, also patriarchy and many women's fight to rid themselves of it. So where does all of this leave us? Well, I think one thing to be avoided is some kind of knee-jerk reaction. There's no need for moral panic here. And that's because the discipline of history is not about facts. It's about the interpretation of facts. Or perhaps more precisely, it's about the interpretation of different forms of historical evidence. Widely accepted interpretations of key events I guess we could call these dominant narratives. These interpretations change over time, and they often change as a result of social change within society. And I can give you a good example from one of the best examples I have is from American history and American historiography. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, the mainstream interpretation of Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War in the late 1860s and 1870s, was that it was a tragic era in American history when Black rule was imposed upon the brave but defeated Confederates. And the story ran that the emancipated slaves had been given the vote far too soon, before they had been educated up to the duties and responsibilities of citizenship. And inevitably, the result was rampant corruption in the post-war South, widespread unrest caused by white Southerners' justifiable determination to resist the imposition of carpetbag government. This view of Reconstruction was disseminated widely in films like The Infamous Birth of a Nation. I say infamous, but it was very popular in the North as well as the South during the second decade of the 20th century. And it's also perpetuated in Gone with the Wind as well. Now, this view of Reconstruction, this very negative view of Reconstruction, altered in the 1970s and 1980s when professional historians influenced by the non-violent campaigns of the civil rights movement, and indeed, I think, by violent white Southern resistance to the civil rights movement, particularly in the context of the Cold War, professional historians began to revisit Reconstruction, and they reinterpreted that period as a remarkable attempt to forge an interracial democracy in the defeated Confederacy. And in this new narrative, Reconstruction appears as an attempt to forge this interracial democracy that was thwarted by violence inflicted on blacks by the former ex-Confederates, who of course held fast to their belief in white supremacy. And it was also caused by the failure of the United States government to secure justice for the freed people whose rights had appeared to be guaranteed via the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And it was no accident, I think, that this much more positive account of Reconstruction was pretty much the same as a long-standing African-American narrative of the post-war era, which had long been circulating beyond the gaze of white historians in the age of Jim Crow. During the era of segregation, basically, black historians developed their own narrative of Reconstruction as a very positive era in American history. But their work was just not read by the vast majority of white historians. That's what segregation was all about, or partly about. So the collapse of racial segregation, the growth of a much more assertive black political and cultural voice in the 1960s and 70s, it's really this that belatedly moved white historians to shift their perspective on a vital period in US history, which I think continues to be poorly studied and understood at the high school level, partly, I think, because it's such a complex era in US history. So shifting interpretations of past events, shifting historical landscapes, if you like, are to be expected. Some folks may find this unsettling, deeply unsettling, and up to a point I can empathize with them. And again, let me draw on my own experience. I'm currently working on how and why the Northern victors' memory of the Civil War, what Northerners routinely called the War of the Rebellion, I'm looking at how that memory, that victor's memory, faded so quickly during the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm asking you to think for a moment of those Union veterans, some of whom are buried in cemeteries close to you, the towns Cemetery, for example, which I think is in Amber Township in Mason County. These Union veterans had assumed that their version of events would persist for all time. But in fact, they'd only reached middle-aged during the 1880s and 1890s when they began to realize that they were very wrong about this. Younger Northerners had little interest in raising what they regarded as old issues, outdated issues like black civil rights, and they had no interest or little interest in demonizing defeated Confederates as rebels and traitors. And by this time, by the late 19th century, the ex-Confederates themselves had regained political power in the South at the end of Reconstruction. And just as alarmingly to Union veterans, they were now claiming to have acted during the Civil War as patriotic Americans, defending their rights and their homes. So these Union veterans who had risked their lives to save the American Republic now had to witness the eclipse of their heroic Unionist narrative by a sentimental reconciliatory account of the Civil War. And this was an account that recognized the Confederates as courageous and principled fellow Americans. And this is a narrative, of course, that served the consensual aims of the United States in the late 19th century, during the age of industrialization and American imperialism in the Philippines and other parts of the Pacific, and indeed the Caribbean. So the Union veterans watched textbook histories being rewritten to better reflect contemporary realities. These books refuted their own deep conviction that they had fought for a morally superior cause. They watched too, not only as white Southerners raised monuments to celebrate traitors like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis as heroes, but they also had to watch these white Southerners parading around the streets of Richmond and other Southern cities with Confederate battle flags. So not surprisingly, very many of these veterans were profoundly anxious and indeed dispirited about how their history of the War of the Rebellion was being rewritten before their very eyes. So again, historical interpretations change over time. This is nothing new. It's to be expected. It's certainly not the job of the trained historian to craft and bolster familiar, feel-good narratives. It seems to me that's what politicians do, and they usually do it to promote their own agendas. Historians try to explain the past to a modern audience by sifting and weighing the evidence, the available evidence, as rigorously and dispassionately as they possibly can. Sure, they're crafting a story of sorts. It's not called history for nothing, his story. And certainly historians approach their material with agendas, which are shaped by the times in which they live. There is no such thing as genuinely objective history. But historical truth, just like Thomas Jefferson's happiness, it seems to me, while it can be maddeningly elusive, historical truth, just like happiness, is something we all can and should pursue. The historian's task is a pretty tough one. It's to comprehend societies that no longer exist and to explain events that at best are only selectively remembered in the present. And they do this by scrutinizing their own motives as rigorously as possible in order to ensure that they are not, like politicians, molding the evidence to fit their own preconceived ideas. History, metaphorically, is not black and white because past societies, just like our own society, well, these things are complex entities. History is nuanced, it's full of grey areas. No major event can possibly have a single cause, certainly not watershed events in American history like the Revolution and the Civil War. Good history writing requires robust contextualization. It requires close attention to cause and effect, the connectedness of events, and also the ability to synthesize, to bring together into a seamless and convincing argument copious amounts of documentary evidence and contemporary research on a particular topic. As a college level history teacher, my job was always to develop my students' critical skills, to encourage them not only to ask hard questions, hard and intellectually useful questions about the world around them and about their historical projects and about their materials that they were using, but also to scrutinize their own work as rigorously as possible in order that they could produce the most convincing arguments possible. History then is a discipline that promotes continuous scrutiny of oneself, of the past, and of the world around us today. And I believe that its practice is essential to the workings of a healthy democracy. The historian's pursuit of the truth, of course, is why authoritarian states seek to control the discipline by embedding their chosen self-serving narratives of a nation's past into the minds of the people. Anyone who has the skills and the determination to bust open politically instrumental narratives like Vladimir Putin's heroic account of the Soviet Union's great patriotic war against Nazi Germany is bound to be a threat to the regime. Hence the desire of authoritarian states and politicians more generally to try and control and monopolize the way the past is written about and remembered. The Chinese government's ongoing determination to wipe out any traces of the Tiananmen Square massacre in Chinese history and memory is a case in point, and some of you will no doubt have noted the Chinese government's destruction of the Tiananmen Square memorial in Hong Kong very recently. I'm coming to a close. So the 1619 project, it seems to me, is best thought of as an African-American counter-narrative of American history, one that runs counter to the orthodox, that familiar account, that Liberty Bell account of the nation's past that Donald Trump wanted to convey. I have no doubt in my own mind that it is no less patriotic in intent and indeed in effect than Trump's style of history. After all, what could be more patriotic than wanting to improve one's beloved homeland by rendering its history more honest and inclusive? Here again, we come back to the importance of self-scrutiny. Self-scrutiny is vital for the health of individuals, for communities, and for nations. After all, if you can't recognize your own flaws, then you can't you can't begin to get rid of them. Continuous scrutiny is hard but necessary work. If you don't scrutinize yourself, the world around you, if you don't ask hard, purposeful questions about your own narratives and the ones peddled by the media and politicians of all political stripes, then you are playing your own part in weakening the fabric of democracy. You fail the test of being an active and properly informed citizen. You become, let's make no bones about it, an ally of authoritarian politicians. If the 1619 project is being taught in a school near you, my advice is not to call for the head of the teacher. I'd expect to see that kind of thing in Texas and Florida, but not in the old free state of Michigan. And certainly not in Mason County, where so many of the townships are named after Union heroes like Meade and Logan and Grant. Most parents, let's face it, are not trained historians. So leave the job of teaching history to those with an understanding of the discipline. Instead, I'd be inclined to see the positive aspects of having a fresh, alternative narrative of American history being taught in class, a narrative that fosters not guilt on the part of students, but one that encourages them to recognize the gap between the glittering promise and the sometimes difficult reality of American life for many people, to see the linkages between the wrongs of the past and those of the present. An awareness of that gap between the promise and reality of American life has often been a very creative one. It fueled the abolitionist and agrarian populist movements of the 19th century and the progressive and civil rights movements of the 20th. But by all means, encourage your children to ask their teachers intelligent, informed questions about the material that is being taught to them. How, for example, does the 1619 Project narrative, centered almost wholly around the experience of African Americans, how does it explain the role of Native Americans, Hispanic people, Chinese immigrants in US history? For that matter, how does it explain the very significant part played by whites in the anti-slavery and civil rights movements? In my experience, young people want to know the truth. They don't want to be fobbed off with complacent tales of national greatness disseminated by designing adults. And let's face it, these kind of complacent stories don't sound very convincing in the turbulent era of Trump, Black Lives Matter, and COVID. Good history teachers, and I doubt not that there are very many of them in the Michigan school system, whether they're using the 1619 Project or not, will surely welcome probing, intelligent questions from their students. Some people might not like it, but the landscapes of history, as I say, are always shifting. In a functioning democracy, truth will out eventually. The white citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, succeeded in covering up the mass killing of Black citizens in 1921 in their community for many decades. But after much hard work by individuals, including the historian Scott Ellsworth, who teaches at the University of Michigan, the truth of that appalling massacre, one of many racial massacres in American history, is now widely known. And the bodies, just like those of the Republican victims of Franco's authoritarian regime in Spain, those bodies are now being located and exhumed. Seems to me only with a widespread public recognition of the truth about the past and a frank acknowledgement on the part of the city of Tulsa that a great wrong was committed in 1921 is any kind of intercommunal reconciliation possible in present-day Oklahoma. And what applies to one community surely applies to the nation as a whole. We live in depressingly polarized times in which authoritarianism is on the rise across the globe. And many politicians in our own avowedly democratic countries, both the UK and the United States, are reluctant to confront the often difficult truths of history. A lot of British conservative politicians do not want British students, school children, to learn about the experience of slavery in the British Empire. But it is up to all of us to hold these politicians up to the standards of democracy that the best of our forebears, and I include those patriotic Michiganders who defied the profoundly racist regimes of the Confederacy and Nazi Germany. We need to hold these politicians to standards that our forebears would recognize and respect. Thank you, and I hope we can have some questions and some discussion.
Are there questions here in the audience live? I don't see any yet online. It's a fascinating conversation. I think that things that you've raised, I'm actually sitting.
I can see a point about the Confederate flag being flown in the streets of Ludington, Brooke?
There are Confederate flags flown
Well,
here.
my own view is that anyone flying the Confederate battle flag in Ludington should be not just ignored, but be confronted. The battle flag is a notorious symbol of white supremacy. The Confederacy itself was founded in white supremacy, the belief that black people are inferior to white, and I see no reason in a modern interracial democracy like the United States why that racist symbol should be being flown visibly. And I'm pretty sure I know what the Union veterans buried in the town cemetery and other cemeteries like it would think of the sight of that flag being flown in the streets of Ludington.
You speak of the Confederate flag. In fact, when we deal with race, there will be 2 sessions devoted to looking at the Confederate monuments and symbols. And one of them, let me have this. And the first session will be actually the words from John C. Calhoun. He died before the Civil War occurred, but it is what he felt about blacks and whites. And so there's, just to hear a voice from the times, and we'll have an actor portraying him. And then the next week will be a more intellectual, historical kind of conversation. So we'll have both that human experience. So that's it's. Anyway, are there questions now here? Rebecca.
Yeah, I just have is this working? A question about the veterans that you mentioned from the Civil War. Did they go into the battle thinking about freeing the slaves, or was it more saving the Union, or both, or, I'm just curious. Didn't know.
No, that's a great question. It's really the point that I was making, that only minority of Union veterans, quite a small minority of Union veterans, were abolitionists. Although they were abolitionists enclaves throughout the Midwest. For example, the Western Reserve of Ohio around Cleveland was thick with abolitionists, and regiments from some of these areas were hostile to slavery from the get-go. But the vast majority of Union veterans were not hostile, were not abolitionists, and certainly had little or no love for African Americans. Most of them, of course, had never seen African Americans, or very few of them. However, what is important to note, I think, is that as the Union armies moved progressively through the southern states, as they did from late 1861 onwards, then they began to realize that the only people that they could trust in states like Mississippi and South Carolina and Georgia, the only people they could trust were really African Americans who were loyal to the United States. They were highly supportive of the Union troops, and of course, whenever they came into the vicinity of a plantation, the majority of slaves would flee to Union lines. They weren't always terribly well received once they got to Union lines, but broadly speaking, the enslaved population was fiercely loyal to the Union, and Union troops began to realize this. And of course, Abraham Lincoln in 1862 issues the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, followed up by the January the 1st, 1863 proclamation, which is very much a military measure, because Lincoln recognizes, like so many Northerners, that the war is not going to be won unless slavery is attacked because it is such a great strength to the Confederacy. So the Civil War is very, very complex, but in the act of defeating the Confederacy, more and more of these Union veterans come to appreciate the fact that African Americans are on their side. And of course, again, don't forget 200,000, roughly 200,000 African Americans fight in segregated regiments for the Union. And what I found in my work is that as late as the 1880s and 1890s, very significant numbers of these Union veterans remember the fact that African Americans had fought for the Union, that Southern whites had tried to destroy it, and they continued to support civil rights for African Americans even after Reconstruction has failed in the 1870s. So it's a complex. Your question is a great one, and it's a complex story. But broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a lot of these Union veterans who went into the war, who had little or no interest or understanding of African Americans, by 1865, a lot of them are very appreciative of the role that they played in the war, in their efforts to defeat the Confederacy, and as a result are highly supportive of civil rights, including the right to vote for African Americans.
Rebecca, did you want to ask anything else? I mean, it's a powerful answer. Yeah, okay. Any other questions right at this point? I mean, I know Thomas is behind me right at this point, but I only want to say, let's get this Zoom on the website as soon as possible. It'd be great to listen to it again. It's just been a tale of enormous interest for me. I'm sitting here and, thinking that American Studies, did work in graduate school. I know this stuff. I don't. It's just fascinating to see, how complex it is. And that the more information you get from the various different eyes, the perspectives, the better off we will all be. And we shouldn't just say, oh, because you're a communist or because you're, far on the right, don't come into this room. We need all those voices in the room, and collaboration is the only way we'll get to truth.
Brooke, I see a question from Carmen on the chat.
Oh, good. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, you read it because we can hear you. So if you want to do that,
okay.
That's fine.
So Carmen is asking about history, a story of events told through the perspective of the writer. Sure. Historically, the stories that were told by the perspective of the rich and powerful because they were the only ones with the means to record their voice. Do you see ways in which history is being written changing as more people have access to a broad voice? I think that's absolutely right. In the 19th century, American history was being written by sort of wealthy amateur historians, like Henry Adams, for example, one of the best of them. But these were pretty well-to-do people who were writing, well-to-do white men who were writing the history of America. And it's white historians in the main whose work was read by the American public during most of the 20th century. But I think since the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements of the 1960s, I think this has really begun to change as more African Americans are being trained as historians in American universities. Then inevitably the African American role in U.S. history it's being written about. So that's what I was saying really when I was talking about the impact of social change on historiography and on dominant narratives. The civil rights movement and Black Power movements were major events in modern American history, and they have given African Americans a much greater voice. Once upon a time, slavery, there was no mention of slavery, for example, national park sites, at battlefield sites. But because African Americans, including African American politicians like Jesse Jackson Jr., pushed for this, slavery now has to be incorporated into the narratives which are disseminated at National Park Service sites. So that's again just one piece of evidence really that supports Carmen's point, I think.
Truly, history is written not only by the victors, but people as they emerge who are powerful, as Black historians now are. I think too of, some years ago before there was any women's history. Women had to write it. It's Blacks have to write this history because they're the ones who are interested and get our attention. So what a powerful evening. I appreciate this, Robert, very much. I know it is now, 2:30 for you?
No, it's only 1:30.
Oh, only 1:30 for you. Okay, well, but so thank you all on Zoom and here live at LACA. And again, Robert, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating. It's a great pleasure to be with you.